Speaker Vorath Keln stood at the podium for the last time and looked out across the chamber that had once represented the greatest civilization in known space. The seats were less than half full now. The Kovathi hegemony had collapsed into civil war 3 years ago, torn apart by factions who blamed each other for driving away the humans and destroying the economic foundations of their empire. The Velith Consortium had retreated to their core worlds after their medical synthesis networks failed completely, their population declining as diseases that had once been easily treated became death sentences once again. The Nathari Collective had lost 11 colony worlds to the Void Swarm before they managed to establish a new early warning network, and they had never fully recovered from the shame of needing 60 years to do what humans had done quietly and without recognition for decades. Vorath had served as speaker for the past year, though the title meant less with each passing month, and he had called this final assembly to do something that no council leader had ever done before. He was going to tell the truth. "We failed," he said, and his voice echoed through the half-empty chamber with a clarity that surprised even him. "We failed not because we were weak or because our enemies were strong, but because we could not see what was right in front of us." He paused and looked at the empty section where the human delegation had once sat, a space that had never been filled by any other species, because nobody could bring themselves to occupy those abandoned seats. "The humans asked us for respect," he continued. "They did not demand power or territory or resources. They did not threaten us or try to manipulate us. They simply asked to be treated as equals. And we laughed at them." A murmur spread through the assembly, but Vorath pressed on because this needed to be said, and he was running out of time to say it. "We laughed because we thought that respect was something that had to be earned through military strength or technological achievement or ancient lineage. And we could not understand a species that measured worth in different ways." He gripped the podium with his manipulator appendages and felt the weight of decades pressing down on his shoulders. "The humans measured worth in patience and service and the willingness to do unglamorous work without expecting praise," he said. "They measured worth in showing up every day and doing the jobs that nobody else wanted to do. And we dismissed all of that as insignificant because we could not see past our own definitions of value." He thought about Ambassador Park and her silent departure and the question she had asked about her daughter. The question that nobody had answered because nobody had cared enough to try. "We killed 3 million of their people and faced no consequences," Vorath said, and he saw several ambassadors flinch at the bluntness of his words. "We destroyed a colony and called it an internal matter. And when they asked for justice, we gave them silence. And then we wondered why they stopped believing in us." The chamber had become very quiet now. "I am resigning as speaker," Vorath announced. "Not because I have failed in my duties, though I have, but because this council no longer represents anything worth leading." He stepped away from the podium and walked toward the exit, and nobody tried to stop him because there was nothing left to say. The doors closed behind him, and he walked through the corridors of Nexus Prime, past monuments to achievements that now seemed hollow, past memorials to victories that had cost more than they were worth, past all the symbols of a civilization that had been built on the assumption that power was the only thing that mattered. He did not know where he was going. He only knew that he could not stay here any longer. 50 years later, a Nathari explorer named Selaith reached the edge of mapped space in a small research vessel that had been searching for signs of the Void Swarm's origin point. What she found instead was humanity. The first human ship she encountered was enormous, far larger than anything the Council had ever built, and it approached her with no hostility and no suspicion, just calm professional curiosity. They welcomed her aboard and gave her food and drink and showed her to comfortable quarters. And they answered her questions with the same patient courtesy that Ambassador Park had once shown to species who did not deserve it. The humans had spread across 100 worlds in the new territories, and their civilization was thriving in ways that made Scyllath's heartache with something she could not quite name. They had built cities of impossible beauty and developed technologies that surpassed anything the Council had ever achieved. And they had done it all without war or conquest or the exploitation of other species. When Scyllath asked how they had accomplished so much in only 50 years, her host smiled and told her that they had simply applied the same principles they had always used: patience, service, the willingness to do the work without expecting praise. They asked about the Council with polite interest, the way one might ask about distant relatives who had lost touch long ago. And Scyllath realized with a shock that humanity had not spent the past 50 years hating the species who had wronged them. They had simply stopped thinking about the Council at all. The old civilization that had laughed at their petition and killed their people and dismissed their contributions had become irrelevant. A footnote in human history that children learned about in school and then forgot. When Scyllath returned to Council space and delivered her report, she watched the faces of the surviving leaders as they absorbed the truth of what humanity had become. The humans had not failed without the Council. The Council had failed without the humans, and the worst part, Scyllath realized, was that humanity bore no grudge and sought no revenge and felt no satisfaction in the Council's decline. They simply did not care anymore. That indifference was the final wound, the one that would never heal, because it meant that everything the Council had done and everything they had refused to do and every choice they had made for 80 years had resulted in something worse than hatred. It had resulted in being forgotten. Scyllath lived another 200 years and never stopped wondering what the galaxy might have looked like if the Council had simply said yes to a small, quiet woman who had asked for nothing more than respect. She never found an answer. Nobody did. The border station had become a place of pilgrimage for those who still believed that reconciliation was possible. And Harrick's den had returned 4 times in the past year, each time hoping for a different answer, and each time receiving only silence. On his 5th visit, he stopped hoping. He sat alone in the station's observation lounge and watched the automated beacon drift through its endless orbit, playing its recorded message to ships that no longer came. And he wondered how history would remember this moment when everything changed. The archives had revealed the truth, and the truth was worse than anything Harrick had imagined. It had taken him months to piece together the full story because nobody had bothered to keep proper records of human affairs. Nobody had considered their grievances worth documenting. Nobody had thought that the small, soft creatures from the harsh world would ever matter enough to require attention. That they had mattered. They had always mattered. The colony world was called New Bizon, and 3 million humans had lived there in a settlement that had existed for 40 years before the Kolvathi hegemony decided that the system was strategically valuable and that humanity's claim to it was not recognized under Council law. The humans had protested through diplomatic channels, filing petitions and requesting hearings and doing everything that civilized species were supposed to do when they faced injustice. The Council had ruled that New Bizon fell within Korvathi expansion territory and that humanity, as a provisional member, had no standing to contest the decision. 6 months later, the Korvathi fleet arrived and demanded evacuation. The humans had asked for time to organize transport for 3 million people, and the Korvathi had given them 72 hours. It was not enough when the deadline passed and the evacuation was incomplete. The Korvathi had fired on the remaining settlements, and the death toll had reached 3 million before anyone on the Council even knew what was happening. Ambassador Park had come before the assembly with evidence and testimony and recordings that showed exactly what had occurred. And she had asked for one simple thing: justice. The council had debated for 6 hours and then ruled that the matter was an internal Korvathi affair, that humanity had been warned to evacuate, and that the loss of life, while regrettable, did not constitute a violation of council law. Ambassador Park had stood there in the chamber and received this verdict without expression. And then she had asked a single question. "My daughter lived on New Bizin," she had said, her quiet voice somehow cutting through the vast space like a blade. She was a teacher, and she stayed behind to help organize the evacuation of her students. And she died in the third bombardment because there was not enough time. She had paused and looked around the chamber at all the species who had decided that 3 million human lives were not worth even a formal investigation. Was a life worth nothing to you? She had asked. Nobody had answered. Nobody had needed to answer, because the silence itself was the answer. And Ambassador Park had understood that silence perfectly. She had waited another 5 years after that. Harrix had discovered, serving as ambassador with perfect professionalism, and never once mentioning her daughter, or the colony, or the ruling that had declared 3 million deaths to be legally acceptable. She had waited because she still believed that things could change, that the council would eventually recognize humanity's value, that justice delayed was not the same as justice denied. The petition for equal representation had been her final test when the council laughed. She had received her answer, and she had accepted it with the dignity of someone who had finally stopped hoping for something that was never going to come. Harrix closed the archive files and sat in the darkness of the observation lounge and thought about what he had done. He had led the vote against humanity. He had laughed at their petition. He had told his colleagues that humans were emotional primitives who would come crawling back within a year. And he had believed every word of it because believing otherwise would have required him to question everything his people had done. The young trader's words echoed in his mind. "You taught us what we were worth to you." He thought about his own children and what he would have done if they had been killed, and the killers had faced no consequences, and the universe had simply shrugged and moved on as though their lives had never mattered. He thought about standing before an assembly of powerful beings and asking for justice and receiving only silence. He thought about waiting 5 years and trying again and being laughed at by creatures who had never lost anything and never would. Observation lounge door opened and the station commander entered. A Nathari named Vess, who had been assigned to this posting as punishment for some political failure that she refused to discuss. "Ambassador," she said, "there is a transmission coming through from human space." Harrix looked up sharply, hope flickering despite his determination to abandon it. "They're speaking to us." Vess shook her head, and her bioluminescent patches flickered with colors that Harrix could not interpret. "No," she said. "It is a general broadcast, not directed at us specifically, and it appears to be a celebration of some kind." She activated the lounge display, and the screen filled with images of human cities and human ships and human colonies spread across worlds that Harrix did not recognize. Worlds beyond the mapped territories. Worlds that humanity had found and settled without telling anyone. They were celebrating an anniversary. 10 years since they had discovered the passage to the new territories. 10 years since they had begun building a civilization that owed nothing to the council and wanted nothing from the species that had dismissed them. The broadcast showed children playing in parks under alien suns and families gathering for meals and workers constructing buildings that reached towards skies of purple and gold. And everything was beautiful, and everything was thriving, and everything was completely beyond the council's reach. Harrix watched the celebration and understood at last that humanity had not merely survived their departure from council space, they had flourished. They had found something wonderful, just as the young trader had said, and they had built something magnificent without any help from the species, who had laughed at their request for basic respect. The broadcast ended with a simple message displayed in every known language, and Harrix read the words and felt something break inside his chest. We remember where we came from, and we are grateful for the lesson. And we wish you well. We wish you well. Not revenge, not anger, not hatred. Just the polite indifference of people who had moved on and no longer needed anything from those who had hurt them. The diplomatic vessel Righteous Purpose hung motionless at the edge of human space, and Harrix Den stood at the observation window and stared out at the stars that had never looked so cold. 6 months had passed since Ambassador Park walked out of the council chamber, and in those 6 months, everything that Harrix had believed about the natural order of the galaxy had been proven wrong. He was here to fix that. He was here to bring the humans back. The council had given him full authority to negotiate any terms necessary because they had finally begun to understand what they had lost, and the price of that understanding had been measured in failed systems and collapsed networks and 2 colony worlds that had gone silent in the Thresh sector. Harrix had voted against the human petition for equal representation. He had led that vote, in fact, because the Korvathi hegemony had always viewed humans with deep suspicion. These small, soft creatures, who came from a world of extreme temperatures and violent weather and gravity that would crush most species flat, humans should not have survived their own planet. And the fact that they had somehow thrived there had always made the Korvathi uncomfortable in ways they never openly discussed. But Harrix was discussing it now, alone in his cabin at night when sleep refused to come. And he was beginning to see things that he had refused to see before. The communications officer interrupted his thoughts with a quiet announcement. "Ambassador, we are receiving a response to our hails." Harrix turned from the window and straightened his ceremonial robes and prepared himself for the negotiation that would determine the future of Council civilization. On screen, he commanded. The display activated and showed nothing but empty space and a small automated beacon drifting. Against the backdrop of distant stars, a recorded message began to play, and Harrix recognized the voice immediately, even though he had only heard it once before. It was Ambassador Park, speaking in that quiet tone that the translation systems had always struggled to amplify. And her words were simple and clear and absolutely devastating. "We remember how you voted," she said. "We remember what you said, and we wish you well." The message ended. Harrix waited for more, for demands or conditions or even threats, but there was nothing else, just silence. He ordered his communications officer to send another hail, and then another, and then a dozen more. But the only response was the same recorded message playing on an endless loop. "We remember how you voted. We remember what you said. We wish you well." The Righteous Purpose remained at the border for 3 days, sending messages into the void and receiving nothing in return. And Harrix began to understand something that changed. Everything he thought he knew about humanity, they were not angry anger he could have worked with because anger was familiar, and anger could be negotiated, and anger eventually burned itself out. This was something else entirely. This was sorrow. The humans had not left in fury or in spite, or in the heat of wounded pride. They had left in grief. The deep, quiet grief of people who had finally given up on a relationship they had desperately wanted to work. Harrix thought about his own people and how they had treated humans over the past 80 years. The small insults and casual dismissals and the constant reminders that humanity was tolerated rather than welcomed. He thought about the petition for equal representation and how the council had laughed, not openly but in their eyes, and how Ambassador Park had seen that laughter and understood exactly what it meant. He thought about all the times humans had offered help and been ignored, All the times they had contributed and been overlooked. All the times they had asked for nothing more than basic respect and been told that they had not yet earned it. On the third day, a small trading vessel appeared at the edge of scanner range. Not an official ship, but a private craft operating outside the boundaries of human government. Harris ordered his crew to make contact. And to his surprise, the trader responded she was young, perhaps 30 years old by human reckoning. And she had the look of someone who had seen much of the galaxy and been disappointed by most of it. "You are wasting your time," she said without preamble. "The government is not going to talk to you, and even if they did, it would not change anything." Harris leaned forward in his command chair and tried to project an openness. He did not entirely feel please, he said. "Help me understand what we can do to repair this relationship." The young woman laughed. But it was not a cruel laugh, and it carried no satisfaction or triumph. Only a deep weariness that seemed far too old for her years. "You still do not understand," she said. "There is nothing to repair because there was never anything to repair. And we have finally stopped pretending otherwise." She paused and looked directly into the screen, and Harris felt as though she was looking straight through him into some part of his soul he had never examined. "We found something," she continued, "beyond the mapped territories. Beyond everything the Council has ever explored. We found something wonderful. And we could have shared it with you. We wanted to share it with you. But you taught us what we were worth to you." Her voice softened but did not waver. "So now we will build alone," she said. "And you will never know what you might have had. And that is not revenge, Ambassador. That is simply the consequence of your choices." The transmission ended. Herrick sat in his command chair for a long time after the trader ship disappeared into the darkness. And he thought about consequences and choices, and the terrible weight of things that could never be undone. He thought about the 3 million humans who had died on the colony world that the Korvathi had destroyed. During their expansion, the colony that Ambassador Park's daughter had called home. And he wondered for the first time if perhaps the Council had earned exactly what it was now receiving. He gave the order to return to Nexus Prime. There was nothing more to be done here. The humans had made their position clear without ever raising their voices or issuing a single threat. And that clarity was somehow more final than any war could have been. Engineer Torvax of the Machinery Guild had spent his entire career solving problems that other people considered impossible. And in 400 years of service, he had never encountered a mystery he could not unravel. Until now he stood in the central control room of the Korvathi shipyards, the largest manufacturing facility in known space. And he watched as 17 different systems displayed the same error message in 17 different languages. Maintenance protocol not found, calibration data unavailable, service contract terminated. The Korvathi overseer, a young officer named Keleth who had clearly never experienced a crisis of any kind, paced back and forth behind Torvax with his claws clicking against the metal floor in a rhythm that was beginning to drive the old engineer toward violence. "How can this be happening?" Keleth demanded for perhaps the 100th time. "We built these systems ourselves with Korvathi engineering and Korvathi materials and Korvathi labor. So how can they possibly depend on anyone else?" Torvax sighed and pulled up another diagnostic screen and began to explain something that should have been obvious to anyone with basic technical training. "You built the systems," he said in the patient voice he reserved for fools and children. "But you did not maintain them, and there is a significant difference between building a thing and keeping it running." He pointed to a schematic that showed the power distribution network for the entire shipyard complex. "This junction here controls the flow of energy to your primary assembly lines," he continued. "It was installed 60 years ago by Korvathi engineers who followed Korvathi specifications exactly as designed. and it worked perfectly for approximately 3 months before it began to degrade. Khaleth stopped pacing and stared at the screen with his 4 eyes narrowed in confusion. "Then how is it still functioning?" he asked, because a human maintenance crew came in and recalibrated it. Torvax replied, and then they came back 6 months later and recalibrated it again. And they have been doing this every 6 months for the past 60 years without fail. And nobody ever noticed because nobody ever asked what the humans were actually doing here. He switched to another screen that showed a list of contracts and service agreements and maintenance schedules that stretched back decades. "The humans never sold you technology," he said. "They never competed with your engineers or your scientists or your manufacturers, because they knew they could not win that competition. So instead they sold you something else, something that nobody else wanted to provide, because it was boring and unglamorous and involved no recognition or praise." Torvax turned to face the young overseer directly. "They sold you the work of keeping everything running," he said. "They sold you patience and attention to detail and the willingness to show up every single day to perform tasks that nobody would ever thank them for. And now that they are gone, you are discovering just how much you depended on people you never bothered to notice." Khaleth stood in silence for a long moment, and Torvax could see the realization spreading across his face like a sunrise over a barren world. "How many systems?" Khaleth finally asked, and his voice had lost all of its earlier arrogance. Torvax turned back to his console and began running a new query across the entire Korvathi network. The numbers that came back made even him pause. "All of them," he said quietly. "Every major installation in Korvathi space has human maintenance contracts embedded so deeply into their operational structure that removing them would require essentially rebuilding from the ground up. And I suspect the same is true for every other council species as well." He thought about Ambassador Park, the small, quiet woman who had stood before the council and asked for nothing more than equal treatment. And he wondered if she had known even then what would happen when her people finally walked away. He pulled up the council archives and found the record of her final statement, the one that Speaker Vorath had recently uncovered. And he read the words again, even though he had already memorized them. "You will understand when we are gone. The humans had not threatened or demanded or bargained because they had not needed to. They had simply waited for the council to show them exactly how much their contributions were valued. And when the answer came back as nothing, they had accepted that answer with a dignity that Torvax found almost painful to contemplate. He thought about his own people and how they would have reacted to such rejection. The Nethari would have filed formal complaints and demanded investigations and made speeches about justice and fairness that would have accomplished nothing but would have made them feel important. The Korvathi would have threatened war and mobilized their fleets and turned the situation into a test of strength that they could win through intimidation. The Veleth would have pleaded and negotiated and offered compromises that would have only delayed the inevitable. But the humans had done none of these things. They had simply walked away in silence. And that silence was now echoing through every system in council space as machines failed and networks crashed and carefully maintained infrastructure began to crumble. Torvax closed his console and turned to leave the control room. "Where are you going?" Khaleth demanded. "We need you here to fix this." The old engineer stopped at the door and looked back at the young overseer with something that might have been pity. "I cannot fix this," he said. "Nobody can because the problem is not technical. And the solution is not engineering, and the humans are not coming back no matter how many systems fail or how many worlds go dark." He stepped through the door and began the long walk back to his ship. Behind him, the error messages continued to multiply on screens that nobody knew how to repair, maintained by people who had never been thanked for their service. and who had finally stopped waiting for gratitude that was never going to come. The great chamber of the Galactic Council had never felt so empty. Even though every seat was filled, Speaker Vareth Keln stood at the central podium and looked out across the assembly of 12 species, each one representing billions of lives across thousands of worlds. And he felt something he had never experienced in his 40 years of political service. He felt afraid. 3 months had passed since the human delegation walked out of this very chamber. And in those 3 months, everything had begun to fall apart in ways that nobody had predicted and nobody could explain. The Valaith ambassador raised her manipulator arm and requested permission to speak. And Vareth granted it with a wave of his ceremonial staff, though he already knew what she would say, because every ambassador had been saying the same thing for weeks. Now, our medical synthesis facilities have stopped functioning, the Valaith ambassador announced, her voice carrying the harmonic undertones of deep distress that her species could not hide even when they tried. We have traced the problem to 17 different subsystems, and every single one of them was maintained by human technicians under contract with our government. A murmur spread through the chamber like wind through tall grass. The Kovathi representative, a massive creature named Harrick's Den, whose species had led the vote against humanity's petition for equal representation, shifted uncomfortably in his reinforced seat and said nothing. Vareth remembered that day with perfect clarity, because it had seemed so simple at the time and so obviously correct. The humans had come before the council with a formal request, presented by their ambassador, a small woman named Park Soin, who, always dressed in dark colors and spoke in a voice so quiet that the translation systems had to amplify her words. She had asked for full membership status with voting rights, equal to the founding species. The council had laughed. Not openly, of course, because they were civilized beings who understood diplomacy and the importance of maintaining appearances. But the laughter had been there in their eyes and in the way they looked at each other across the chamber. Humanity had only been part of galactic civilization for 80 years, a mere heartbeat compared to the thousands of years the elder species had spent building their empires among the stars. What had humans contributed that could possibly merit equal standing with the Kovathi hegemony, which controlled 40% of all military forces in known space, or the Nathari Collective, whose scientists had unlocked the secrets of faster-than-light travel, or the Velith Consortium, whose medical technology had extended the lifespans of every species by centuries. The vote had been unanimous. Humanity's petition was denied. Ambassador Park had stood there at the speaker's platform, her face completely still, and Vareth had expected anger or tears or threats or desperate bargaining, because that was what every species did when they faced rejection. Instead, she had done something that haunted him now in his sleep. She had looked around the chamber, meeting the eyes of every ambassador one by one, and her expression had been impossible to read because it contained no rage and no sorrow and no fear. It contained something else entirely, something that Vareth had only recently begun to understand. It was the look of someone who had finally received an answer to a question they had been asking for a very long time. Ambassador Park had turned and walked out of the chamber without saying a single word. Her entire delegation had followed her in perfect silence. The doors had closed behind them, and within 6 hours, every human ship in council space had departed for the border. Within 12 hours, all human communications had ceased. Within 24 hours, the humans were gone as if they had never existed at all. The council had celebrated. Vareth remembered the toasts and the speeches about how humanity had finally shown their true nature as emotional primitives who could not handle the sophisticated realities of galactic politics. The Kovathi had been especially pleased because they had always viewed humans with suspicion. These small, soft creatures from a harsh world who smiled too much and asked too many questions and never seemed to understand their proper place in the hierarchy of civilization. Let them sulk in their little corner of space. Herrick's den had said that night at the reception, his massive jaws spreading wide in the Kovathi expression of amusement. They will come crawling back within a year, begging for readmission, and when they do, we will remind them of the cost of their tantrum. Everyone had agreed. Everyone had been wrong. The Netheri ambassador rose now, and her bioluminescent patches flickered with the pale blue light of anxiety as she addressed the assembly. I have completed my investigation into the communications failures affecting our border monitoring stations, she said, and her voice carried none of the confidence that the Netheri were famous for. The humans were operating what they called a volunteer patrol network along the outer territories, and we dismissed it as a mere commercial operation of no strategic importance. She paused, and the blue light across her skin deepened to something closer to purple. We were incorrect, she continued. The human patrol network was our primary early warning system against void swarm incursions, and they maintained it entirely at their own expense without ever asking for recognition or compensation. And now that they are gone, we have lost contact with 2 colony worlds in the Thresh sector. The chamber erupted into chaos. Vorath struck his staff against the podium again and again until order was restored. But he could see the fear spreading from face to face and from species to species like a disease that had no cure. He thought about Ambassador Park and her silent departure, and he wondered what she had been thinking. In that final moment when she looked around the chamber at all of them, he had recently found a record in the archives. A single statement she had made to a junior diplomat before she left, spoken in an old human language that had taken weeks to translate properly. The words were simple, but they cut through. Vorath, like a blade made of ice. You will understand when we are gone. He understood now. He understood that the Council had made a terrible mistake, and the silence that humanity had left behind was only the beginning of a reckoning that none of them had seen coming and none of them knew how to stop.